Hi, my name is Brooke Fitzwater, and I was diagnosed autistic at almost 29 years of age. So I've been diagnosed for a year now, and again, I was almost 29 when I received my diagnosis, and for most of my life, I went not knowing that I was autistic, which right now is the experience of many people. I am perhaps more known for my marine biology content, but while I was going through my PhD, I started realizing some things about myself and things started to fall into place. I had some friends who were also looking into their neurodivergent identities, and they realized that not only were they neurodivergent, but they saw similar traits in me, and so they came to me privately and they said, "Hey Brooke, you might be autistic." And I was like, no, there's no way that I'm autistic. And then I started looking into it. In this video, we're going to be talking about my personal journey to diagnosis. If you've met one autistic person, you've only ever met one autistic person. It's a spectrum, and so everyone that's autistic is going to be a little bit different, and there are differences in like sensory needs, for example, or differences in special interest or safe foods, the types of sims that they use. And somebody watching this video might also be deciding whether or not a diagnosis is for them. And for some people, a diagnosis is the right direction, and for other people, it's not. We also have to address the fact that it's been very difficult for a lot of people to even know that they're potentially autistic because of the way that autism has previously been studied. So in the past, it was even considered that it was only a childhood disorder, which we now know is not the case, that autism is lifelong. And it was predominantly studied in young white boys. So if you were a girl, for example, or if you were AFAB, you might have been missed, especially because of the way that girls or AFAB people are socialized versus, or AMAB boys, for example, are socialized. And you might see different manifestations in autistic traits because of these differences in socialization. But you also have to think about it from an intersectional approach, in that for a long time, autism was very white. A lot of the research was very white. My cat is currently touching the camera, and now she's going to leap onto the bed. Hi! Yes, you've decided to join us today. Anyway, a lot of the research in the past was done exclusively on white people, and it left a lot of other people out of the conversation. And so, for example, it's more difficult for a Black trans woman to seek a diagnosis than it might be for me or for someone who is a white man. These are all really important to consider, and why it's so important that we consider doing more research in these areas, because there are different nuances that we may not have been privy to prior because we weren't researching it. And so it may be more difficult for someone who is not cisgendered, or for someone who is Black, or someone who is Indigenous, or for other people who might have other disabilities, to be considered for an autism diagnosis, which might be a con for some people because it may just be difficult to even get the diagnosis in the first place. There are plenty of stories of people, and I even know people who went to get an autism diagnosis, and even though they had a lot of the symptoms, they were not able to get that diagnosis, or some people even went to get a second opinion and they were able to get their diagnosis. Also, as you're researching a lot of this, just because you suspect that you have some of the traits doesn't mean that you have autism. It could be something else, or it just might be that you share certain traits. It takes a lot of work to be able to self-diagnose, and then it also takes a lot of work for you to get a diagnosis. Self-diagnosis is valid, but you have to put the work into it. You can't just think that you're autistic because you meet two criteria, which most people who self-diagnose don't do. It is also often prohibitively expensive for people to get an autism diagnosis. I was very privileged in that my insurance covered most of my autism diagnosis, and I was also able to do some commissions in order to get funding so that way I could pay for the rest of it. But not everybody has access to that, and It can be as high as $3,000 sometimes, or even more, for people to even get the autism diagnosis in the first place. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about my personal journey towards my autism diagnosis. So I started looking into autism after I said that my friends had mentioned to me that it was a possibility, and I did this 2 years before I actually got my autism diagnosis. Part of that reason was that I was trying to find somebody, and I had to find a therapist, and I had to figure out who I would get referred to. But the other issue is I spent all of those years being terrified that I wasn't autistic and that I was just trying to figure out something to explain what was wrong with me. And so I did everything I could to research autism to see, do I actually fit the criteria? And you can figure some of this out. For example, if you live in the United States, then you can look at the DSM-5 and see, do you match up to the DSM-5 criteria? Now, of course, this is not a perfect metric, but this is what people are going to diagnose you using. You can also look up Embrace Autism. It's a great resource that has lots of different tests that you can use, self-tests, to kind of give you an idea of whether or not you might be autistic. And then if you want to, you can even read the autistic literature. It's not always written by autistic people, and sometimes some of it is more harmful than it is helpful, but there is a lot of good research that's happening now. But I spent 2 years trying to figure out if I was autistic enough to even get tested. And eventually it came to a head that I felt like I really needed a diagnosis for a couple of different reasons. The first and the main reason was that I needed accommodations. So I wanted accommodations for my schooling, and a lot of people think that you can't get them when you're, for example, in your PhD, because what would you use them for? You can use your accommodations at any stage of your academic career, and you can use them at work. I know people who have been able to get them at work. If you are in the United States, you legally can have accommodations, so you should use them. And I needed accommodations for my schooling. And then I also wanted to get a diagnosis because I, as a scientist, felt like I needed somebody else who was a scientist to validate me, like a peer review kind of situation. My cat is, again, doing weird things. Let's grab her. Here's the cat. Hi, Ophelia. Say hi to the people. Anyway, she might appear in this video frequently.
What was I talking about? You distracted me. The kitty cat distracted me, and now this is going to be in the video forever.
Anyway, I really needed that second opinion of somebody to say, hey, you actually are autistic. And I wanted to know more of like the data, because that's who I am. But I spent all this time collecting my own data of why I suspected that I was autistic. And I even gave this color-coded data sheet to the psychologist who did my appointment. So in order to get my referral in the first place, I was already in therapy with a psychologist who was able to refer me to somebody who could test me for autism. So if you're trying to get an autism diagnosis, it may be easier if you already have a therapist who is going to be able to refer you out to someone. But this isn't possible for everyone, and I completely understand this. The other thing that you need to check in with is whether or not the person who is going to be doing your autism diagnosis absolutely needs your parents and or family or friends to fill out information about you so they can get more data about you for your autism diagnosis. Because some places require that parents are the ones that fill out forms, and for some people this is just not possible. So for example, if someone was orphaned, or if they were in foster care, or if their parents died after they turned 18, or if you're in a situation where you have parents that you are estranged from, or it wouldn't be safe for them to know that you're autistic, you might need to check in to see if it's possible for them to do the autism diagnosis without having parents or family intervene in this diagnosis or fill out forms or whatever. Or see if your friends can do it instead of your parents, or even somebody that you work with. Before I get into what the diagnostic process was like, diagnostic processes are different. There are certain things that are going to be the same across the board, but not everything is the same. So the way that it happened for my diagnosis might not be the way that it is for you, but it could be similar. First, when you're going to your assessment, I highly recommend that you bring things that are going to make you feel comfortable. So for example, I have this weighted plushie It's called a moon pal. This is not an advertisement. I received this as part of an advertisement, but this is not an advertisement. This is just also, hopefully you can see it on the camera. But I actually use this thing. I sleep with this every night because it's weighted, and I do really well with weighted items. And I would take this to therapy, and then I also took it to my autism diagnosis because having the weight on me helped me to feel a lot more comfortable. And at first I was really embarrassed because I was nearly 30 years old and I had this. But part of becoming aware of your autism and embracing your autism is allowing you the aids that you need to help you function, to help you feel better, to help you self-regulate. And in this case, this helps me self-regulate, so I had it. But I brought that with me. I brought headphones, things to help me feel comfortable while I was waiting or while I was in the session. And then my sessions were several 1-hour sessions. So the first one, we were trying to do an intake about family history so we could kind of see what's the family history of my experiences, potential trauma, and then trying to see if there were any other potential comorbidities or things that I could have had instead of autism. So essentially what they're trying to do is they're trying to rule out every other thing that it could be besides autism before they can land on autism itself as the diagnosis. Some people also have comorbidities. So for example, I was also diagnosed with unspecified anxiety disorder. I was also sent home with a couple of tests to help, again, rule out other potential comorbidities or other potential explanations for the traits that I was observing. And for some of my assessments, we did an IQ test, but for adults. And so the point of the IQ test was to test processing speed, to make sure that I didn't fall into like the gifted and talented section rather than autistic. Now, IQ tests are not the perfect metric, and they have a lot of problems associated with them. They can be used and have been used for things in the past that are terrible for society and for people, but it can be useful for figuring out things like, what is your processing speed, which was important for me because I had a low processing speed, but I had not had a documentation for that, and it was something that I had struggled with when I was a scientist and in my current PhD, or in the past, I just graduated with my PhD, yay. But taking that test allowed my practitioner to see that I had a slower response speed, and they were able to put that in my autism diagnosis itself. Again, there might be some surveys that you have to take. Some people will do an all-day event. I didn't have to do that, but some people have to go and take a litany of tests, and they have to do it all day, and like they give you a lunch break. But that was not my experience, but it could be yours. And during these autism assessments, you are your biggest advocate, which can be really scary, especially if you're somebody that struggles with social norms or social anxiety, or you don't know how to respond in these kinds of situations. It may seem very overwhelming and very scary. You know yourself best. So if it helps you to come in and say, here's a list of all of the things that make me suspect that I'm autistic, that may be helpful for you. So after your assessment, your practitioner needs a bit of time so that way they can take all of the data and look at what things might point to autism, what things may not. And so you have to wait a little bit, which can be agony, obviously, because you're terrified about whether or not this thing that you think might be the explanation for yourself is true or not. But after your waiting period, you get to go and meet with the practitioner again. They will tell you whether or not they diagnosed you as autistic, and they will give you an explanation as to whether or not they gave you the diagnosis. And so it will have everything on the sheet, like all of the results from all of the tests. For example, mine specifically said that I had a low processing speed. And then some diagnoses will give you a specific level. So some people are like level 1, and it refers to your support needs. So if you're level 1, you may not require as many support needs, but level 2 requires more, for example. And you're able to talk with the psychologist about the results, ask any questions that you might have, and then you have this documentation that you can take elsewhere, for example, if you need accommodations for class. If you don't agree with your results, you can always try again with a different doctor and get a second opinion. For many other medical issues, if you go to a doctor and they don't give you something that resonates with your symptoms or the way that you feel, you would be recommended to go to a different doctor. It's no different for autism. So if you feel like this doctor maybe didn't understand everything, in the way that you needed them to, or you feel like maybe this isn't accurate, you can go and try to get tested again somewhere else. And that's perfectly valid. Some people, after they have received an autism diagnosis, experience what's known as skill regression. And the things that you were able to do previously, you might struggle with doing because your brain is trying to process all of the information, and it's just a lot at one time, and it's fairly normal for you to have issues doing things that you were able to do previously. For me, getting an autism diagnosis was extremely helpful for me to get the accommodations that I needed for school, but to also help me to know, okay, I'm autistic. Now I can make a plan about how am I going to better advocate for myself? How am I going to better care for myself and my needs? It felt like such a weight was lifted off of me. I had this worry of, am I autistic or not? Like, what's wrong with me? And then after getting the diagnosis, I didn't feel that way anymore. And I've grown so much since then to the point that I don't feel like something is wrong with me. I'm just autistic and I have different needs. And some of those might manifest when I'm working in science, or they might manifest when I'm with friends, or it might manifest when I'm at home. And recognizing and making plans for the things that I need, the ways to take care of myself, has been so helpful in my personal healing journey, and that might be the direction that you need to take. It can be really scary trying to get an adult diagnosis because, again, you might be worried that you won't be believed either by the practitioner or friends or family. I hope that this video was helpful for you, and again, this reflects my personal experience. It may not reflect yours, it may not reflect another autistic person's, but I'm hopeful that it will help someone. And let me know if you have any questions or comments. And this is a safe space for everyone. I hope that you're loving yourself and that you're accepting yourself, even if you don't know if you're autistic or not. Okay, bye. Thank you. I don't know how to end videos.